They should have know my name. Okay, I think the door is being closed. Oh, not quite, but good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, I'm short, so I'm literally on my tippy toes here. My name is Flavia Coulter from Container World. I am Container World Business Development and Customer Relations Manager. And I am here to introduce Jim. But apparently Jim already knows quite a few of you that are in here. I am just going to go through a little bit of your bio that Lisa has prepared for me. Jim has, over the last 20 years, has helped to fuel the growth of a leading national restaurant brand, as well as consulted with hundreds of other restaurants to navigate through this ever-changing restaurant industry and probably world, I would say, with what we've gone through in the last 4 years. As the founder and the CEO of Benchmark 60 Restaurant Services, Jim has worked alongside small, medium, and large restaurant companies in North America and the UK in order to help them understand how new concepts help business productivity and employee workload. And his encouragement for leaders to see things differently has been instrumental in the strategy and execution of several successful businesses. I think you have more to say on all of that, so I'm going to leave it to that. And there are some other notes if you can't remember what he does
to say.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. It's good to be here today, and there's some amazing stuff going on in the beer world. Obviously, I've been lucky enough to spend a little bit of time with some people in this part of our industry, but it's definitely a part of the industry I think I'd love to get to know more about. I was asked to come and speak today a little bit about this concept of what's going on really in the world of labor, rising costs, how to make sure we can still give good service and maintain margins and whatnot. So we're going to talk a little bit about how compartmentalizing data actually can drive revenue, improve labor cost, and this concept of productivity, looking through a bit of a different lens in terms of how to manage some of those things. Because what we've done in a lot of our study in the last few years, looking at several different industries, the manufacturing side of beer not being one of them quite yet, but manufacturing in lots of different ways, the auto industry, agriculture, a lot of these industries look at things like productivity in a different way than the hospitality industry does. And so we, a few years ago started thinking about how we could try to implement some of those strategies into food and beverage in order to help negate what's happening in terms of rising costs. So we'll go through a few of those things. Hopefully there's going to be some questions. Happy to answer anything that anybody has. And we'll be around after to have some conversation if anybody's interested. Gotta make sure I push the right button. So I'm not sure if any of you, we'll just start talking about this concept of productivity. I'm not sure if any of you actually use this concept in the food and beverage portion of your businesses, in your tasting rooms, tap rooms, restaurants, whatever they might be. Well, put it down or I push the button. But first of all, typically we talk about what it means and what's the difference between thinking about things in terms of how productive the business is rather than things that just show up on the P&L. Things like labor cost, percentage, and that type of thing, which is obviously a important KPI in food and beverage and any business. The concept of productivity came up for us back in around 2015, actually before our business was even started. But because there was this kind of what I call race to $15 an hour happening in the food and beverage industry, predominantly first in the western part of the country and obviously in Ontario and now across most of our provinces. But we were looking at this and saying, okay, we're at this pricing threshold where we can't charge more for our product, or it's uncomfortable to charge more for the product. And wages are going up, but the only other way that our management teams or people that are running the rooms every night or every day might think about this is, if I can't charge more, I have to just run with less people. I have to work harder. I have to, and that's where we'll talk about some of this workload concept. But we started to think about this in terms of if you can't charge more and you don't want to change your service model, how else are you supposed to negate that rising cost? And so this is where we started talking about, again, compartmentalizing data in order to get really clear on strategic initiatives, really simply for people that are actually trying to work in the room and manage the business every day. So the difference that I always tell people between things like productivity and something like maybe efficiency that some businesses would talk about and lots of businesses would look at is efficiency is about trying to do more with less, right? If we work harder, we can become more efficient. If we find little, nuances and maybe technology, we can become more efficient. But it's really about more with less. And productivity is actually it's more or less about doing more with the same. So how do we just increase output, improve effectiveness, and most importantly, how do we measure that? So there's a couple ways that we can kind of get into how we would measure this depending on the type of business. So this conversation today is specifically directed towards the tasting room, the restaurant, the bar, whatever that portion of your business might be. And it's about, first of all, we would look at things like KP or CPLH, which stands for covers per labor hour. Just create a ratio and start to analyze that. And in the back of house, if you have a kitchen program, we would look at it in terms of food sales per labor hour. The reason we would do that is the scenario I always explain to people is if I was running a little cafe or a little tasting room or a little restaurant, and let's say I'm the owner of this place, and I know for sure that today I'm going to serve 50 customers from open to close. I might think I could probably do that myself, right? I can serve some food. I can ring in some food and beverage. I might even be able to, depending on the food program, I might even be able to cook the food myself if I'm serving 50 people over, let's say, 10 hours. But if we had a crystal ball and said, tomorrow you're going to serve 100 people, you might think about that and go, okay, I probably need to add maybe 2 staff members. Maybe I need someone to help me produce the food and someone to greet customers or something like that, right? If we said the third day you're going to serve 500 people, we know this for a fact, you're going to serve 500 people. You probably would stop and go, okay, hold on a second. I need a whole team of people to help me serve 500 customers, right? But what if I told you that those 500 customers aren't ordering anything? They're having tap water. You still need a full team of people to make sure the experience is good, the stress level is good, your team isn't overwhelmed, they come back to work the next day. And if we look back at that first day of 50 customers, what if I told you that they're all going to spend $100 each? You still could probably serve them with a limited team, but your revenue model, your labor cost model, the whole thing is completely different because a whole team of staff for 500 customers spending nothing means your labor cost is through the roof. And a small team serving 50 people spending $100 each means you're really profitable. Now, how we kind of started originally having this conversation was from experience in running restaurants and talking to restaurateurs and food and beverage outlets was quite often, I think as an industry, we're guilty of thinking about this in terms of sales first. So we go, okay, we're going to do $5,000 in sales on Monday. And we're going to do maybe $6,000 on Tuesday. And we're going to do, if we fast forward to Friday, we might think we're going to do 10,000 on Friday. So we need to add people to make sure that we can service that revenue. And not to jump ahead, but the first thing we see in every scenario where we look at productivity levels in restaurants and labor cost, how that connects to labor cost, is Thursday, Friday, and Saturday are typically the least productive days overall as a business in almost every single restaurant. Because whoever's writing the schedule quite often adds people when they see revenue going up. But if people spend more on Friday, you might not need an extra person to serve them. So we'll come back to that in a second. But this is why we start to look at this in terms of covers and sales per labor hour, rather than just thinking about this in terms of what's my labor cost, what's showing up on payroll, what's my revenue, and what's the percentage. So we would breaking this down into 3 places before I skip to the next slide. Front of house, there's 3 different ways we look at this. Front of house, we would use covers per labor hour, again, because it's people serving people and try to remove the dollar value at the beginning. Back of house, we would look at this in terms of sales, food sales per labor hour, because similar to what I was saying about that little cafe scenario, if I'm working in a kitchen producing food, I don't care if it's one person ordering $100 worth of food or 100 people ordering $1 worth of food. I still have to make $100 worth of food, right? So we would look at this in terms of how much output is the kitchen or the food portion of the business producing, and start to analyze what's happening with that and compartmentalize that data. And in the total operation, we would look at a little bit of both, but typically we would stick to the covers per labor hour version of that metric this way, because it just gives us a really good broad spectrum, and it forces us, going back to the title, it forces us to compartmentalize what's happening so that we can create really simple strategy and direction for people.
You're talking about top room with no food.
Mm-hmm.
You could be looking at orders, like seller sheets.
Yeah, it really, so there's no food program at all. We would look at it in terms of covers per labor hour, but that could mean a few different things. So that could mean orders per hour, that could mean tables per hour, that could mean tickets per hour, that could mean actual customer count. And that's a question we get a lot is, maybe my POS doesn't count covers individually. Well, as long as we compare apples to apples throughout the process, we can get the same. It would just, the only difference would be that it might skew what it thinks your average customer spend would be. Right? So if your average table size is 4 people, your average check might be $80. If we looked at it by cover, your average check might be $20. But as long as we're comparing similar data, there will almost always be what we call consistent inconsistency, right? And as long as we know what those are, we can then use those pieces of information to help create really clear strategy. So not to jump ahead again, but because you asked, a really good example of that might be a business, and I'll get to some of this in a minute, but a business might be having labor cost percentage challenges. And they might be talking to their management team saying, we have to fix this labor cost issue. We have to lower labor costs. It's the margins are off or whatever that might be. Maybe the CFO is calling and saying, lower labor costs. Anyone who's worked in restaurants and multi-unit has probably experienced that. But looking at it and compartmentalizing this way, what we could actually do is, rather than tell the manager, you have to lower labor cost, we could say on Tuesdays, your average table spend is lower than the rest of the days a week. So let's focus on average customer spend on Tuesdays, and it might fix the labor problem for the whole week. Right? So more to come on that, but total operation, if there's no food or if there's no food portion, we would look at it in terms of covers first. The reason, in case anyone's going to ask this, the reason we wouldn't look at sales per labor hour from a front of house perspective only is because if I go into a restaurant and I order a simple appetizer and a water, and the group that comes in next to me sits down and orders filet mignon and a $100 bottle of wine, we're still one customer, but the sales per labor hour associated with that is completely different. It totally changes the labor model. And some companies even reward their people based on salesmanship, right? But that's completely out of the control of the employee. It's the run of the mill, who sat in their section, right? So it's still valuable information in certain ways, but from a productivity and labor management perspective, that's our recommendation. That answer your question?
Yeah.
Fairly long-winded. Sorry about that. So this is an example really quickly, and we'll just talk about when we look at productivity first versus when we don't look at productivity at all. And just actually an example, this is a screenshot from for anyone who knows what Power BI is, this is an example, a screenshot from an actual labor report from a restaurant that we worked with on what was happening before they started looking at productivity and what was happening after. So what I can tell you about this, I don't know if you can see the numbers, but if we look at the screen, the top version, you see numbers 5.05, 4.8, 5.46, 4.61. We're seeing big fluctuation. That number represents customers per labor hour or covers per labor hour. So you can see that they're serving, for the same amount of people, they're serving lots of customers, not as many customers, lots of customers, not as many customers. And what that does, big picture to think about this, what that's doing is it's creating inconsistency in business model. It's creating inconsistency in employee experience. It's creating inconsistency in workload, which we'll get to in a minute about the workload side of retention and whatnot in the hospitality industry. But what we're seeing is really inconsistent results in terms of how productive the business is, which makes it really hard to predict and control and all of those different things. At the bottom, if we can focus with operators running the rooms every single day on how to create more consistency in terms of how many customers or tables or checks or whatever the metric is you want to use, compared to how many staff do I need to serve those people, and try to remove the need to have the revenue piece attached to it right away, we start to see this line flatten out, which means more consistent, again, customer experience, employee experience, workload, and typically the labor cost percentage line becomes almost as flat. Because if we can control how productive the room is, the only variables left are wage and customer spend. And if we can control wage by not scheduling too much overtime, the only variable left is spend. And if we see labor costs go up or down, we know that it's because of how our customer behaved rather than how our business behaved. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So this compartmentalization of data, I don't know if any of you had the chance to go to the Restaurants Canada trade show in Toronto in April. If you went around that trade show and talked to software companies, SaaS products, whatever it might be, technology companies that are approaching the restaurant space, almost all of them were saying the same thing. And that was that we produce almost endless amounts of information, incredibly good dashboards and reporting, a really good product that our customers love. You know, their churn rate is really low. We've got people that love information and technology and hospitality. But there's a gap between the information we have and what to do with it. So I'm sure we've all sat there staring at some sort of report going, well, this is good or bad, but what does it mean and what am I supposed to do with it? So this is one of those things where we start to break down when we're looking at how productive the business is first. It helps to simply compartmentalize exactly where the challenge might be, where the issue is, where there's opportunity, where we should focus our attention, what kind of strategy it might need to be. So on the left, we've got average wage. What goes into affecting average wage? Overtime, pay rates changing, how your managers write their schedules, and maybe there's a minimum wage increase that's out of your control, which if obviously for those in BC know everything about that, right? 1680 now, I think, isn't it? Which is crazy. Anyways, different conversation. The average spend piece, and this is what we actually refer to more as customer behavior. If you think about how your customer behaves, that could change depending on how well trained your staff are and what the interaction is like. It could be based on what the promotion of the day of the week is or the season. It could be based on seasonality, right? Patio time, maybe people drink more beer than they do when it's raining in January, who knows? Or what day of the week it is. So some examples around that would be that there are companies we've spent time with that have really high labor costs in September. And they always start out the conversation by saying, okay, team, September's coming. Let's make sure labor doesn't go up. It's happened, right, Tim? And I remember being in management in multiple different levels, either receiving that end of the conversation or giving that part of the conversation, saying, okay, guys, we know it's January, it's September, revenue's going to change. Let's make sure labor cost doesn't go up. Well, in some cases, it's out of our control, because if it's based on customer behavior, then the kind of scary way that I typically put this is sometimes our industry is left with their only option is to run short-staffed on purpose in order to make sure labor cost doesn't go up. And if you think about that, that's not good for anybody. That's not good for service. That's not good for customer experience. That's not good from a workload perspective or employee experience side of things. So if we start to peel back that and say, okay, what's actually happening here? What's happening if we can control our average wage, we can control how productive the business is, then the only variable left is average spend, and we can attack that going into times that aren't as busy from a revenue perspective. I always show this. This is the direct correlation between productivity and labor cost percentage. Because I think it's important, and it looks like you can actually see it, right? Quite often the conversation starts, well, if we're just more efficient or if we're just more productive, labor costs will go down and everything's good. And that's part of the solution, but it's not always going to fix everything. And again, it's about compartmentalizing information so we can control as many pieces as possible and limit the variability. So if we look at some of these areas, I can point. If we look at some of these areas, like this first spike in the yellow line and drop in the blue line, what we're seeing is productivity dropped for whatever reason, and labor costs went up, right? They're directly correlated in that scenario, right? If you look a little bit further ahead, we see a spike in productivity for whatever reason. That could be good or bad.
but the labor cost line doesn't quite do the same thing. So you might have a team that goes, man, we were short last night. We really worked hard. Everybody had 3 tables more than we usually would have. And you look at the report and go, well, why didn't labor drop the same way? And so I'll talk about, again, the workload thing in a little bit here, but just to kind of do a quick intro on this concept of workload, the number one thing we see happen in almost every scenario when workload crosses into what we call unsustainable threshold, crosses that threshold, is customer spend declines. And we've all been in that scenario probably where you're sitting in a restaurant talking about, should we order another round of drinks? Should we order dessert? And someone at the table goes, well, we haven't seen the server in 20 minutes, so let's go somewhere else. Right? That's an example of us being able to put real life scenario to this data saying that the team is likely having to work too hard and it's impacting spend. So even though the team worked really hard that day, customer spend declined and you actually didn't see the labor cost come down as much as you might hope it would have. Right? Then we've got similar scenarios happening here where we've got drops in productivity and the spike in labor costs happening. This would be an example of one of a couple different things. Either they've overscheduled for a week, thinking it was going to be busier than it was, which happens in September all the time, the other way. And we'll talk more about that. Or they could be training staff. And this is a thing that we spend a lot of time talking to operators about, the concept of what training should do to how productive the business is. Because if you're training people, they should be extra. And if there's extra people working, it's going to change that ratio of how productive the business is. And we've probably all experienced the scenario where a restaurant manager is training in this section, so they send someone home over there because they don't want their labor costs to look bad. Right? So this is a really good way for an operator to say, hey, I was training, which did this to productivity, means labor cost went up, but it's on purpose almost, right? It's an investment in the business, which part of the discussion later is about how to turn labor cost into an investment rather than just looking at it as a cost on the P&L. And then if you continue to go down the line, we've got some really big spikes. Again, you see this massive increase towards the end in terms of productivity and not the same correlating dip in terms of labor cost. And again, that just goes back to, there's more to this concept of how to manage labor cost in a food and beverage outlet than just sales and payroll amount. Does anyone have any questions about that? Most of you are probably thinking, I don't have time to look at this stuff anyway. Yeah, for sure. So the blue line in this scenario is customer per labor hour, covers per labor hour. So it's just a straight ratio. And so, looking at the beginning here, there's somewhere around 5.5 customers for every employee hour over the course of the whole week. So that includes staff that are working before the restaurant's open to get it up and running. That includes them cleaning at the end of the day when there's no customers left. And one of the things that we find that there's lots of good value in with this concept is that if we get really stuck and we're going, the team's been working really hard to try to get the business to be more productive or more profitable, and it's just, we're not able to move the needle, we can then go and say, okay, let's look at this by position, by day of the week, by time of day, by day part, by what did happen versus what might happen or could happen. There's so many ways that we can chop up this information and really be able to say to a manager, your labor cost is high because your productivity level on Tuesdays at lunch from 2 to 4 in the expo position is high. Right? You could really get granular with the data, which probably sounds like this is a lot and would take a ton of time, but it makes things a lot more simple for the manager on the floor every day if they can just worry about one strategy. Mm-hmm. So that's a good question. So that extreme drop, that's not just like the report failed or we stopped looking at it. Yeah, everybody quit, customers came. This example where you see this immense drop in productivity and crazy spike, that's May long weekend. This restaurant expected to be really busy on May long weekend, and it didn't happen. And they scheduled a whole bunch of extra people thinking revenue was going to be really high that week, and it wasn't, for 2 reasons. One, the customer count that they served was not what they thought it was going to be. And what we've learned in a lot of scenarios, not in every concept, but in a lot, is on long weekends, people spread their money out more. They're going to go out Saturday and Sunday, so they don't spend as much. So it impacted the average spend, it impacted the covers per labor hour or productivity level. And moving forward, now they can hopefully predict that better for next time. So they don't see this, 12% front of house service labor cost that everybody then has a meeting about. So it depends what we're trying to accomplish. In this example, the orange dotted line actually represents the target. So there's two ways that we would address that. If a restaurant or a food and beverage outlet or a tasting room, whatever it might be, said, hey, we have a labor cost percentage challenge. We're not happy with the result. The first thing we would probably look at is let's start to measure productivity and compartmentalize the information, figure out what's happening. And then we would likely say for the last 12 weeks or 16 weeks, or choose a large amount of data, this is the average level of productivity that the restaurant has been achieving. And then we could help to proactively model that and say, if it got to this level, here's what we could expect based on current wage and spend, right? So that they don't have to go, well, the only way to lower our labor cost is to work harder or raise prices, right? The other side of that coin is if they realize that we've got a retention issue with people that are burning out and quit, really quickly, which happens a lot, obviously, in our industry, or things like that, we might look at that and say, okay, we should probably actually lower workload or intentionally make the business less productive on purpose, right? Knowing that in most cases, the correlating thing with that is that spend actually comes up. So in a lot of cases, businesses we've worked with have actually lowered the level of productivity on purpose, seen an increase in spend, and their labor cost remains flat, but their people have a better experience. Right. Exactly. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Adam, did that answer yours too? May long weekend. September long weekend, May long weekend, Thanksgiving. Yeah. Okay. Maybe just a quick show of hands. Who's heard the term industry standard labor cost or something like that? What does everybody else do? Where should we be based on what the industry does? So this one creates some good debate sometimes, but we believe that industry standard labor models they don't exist. There could be ranges. There could be the industry average, I guess, depending on what type of business you look at. But time and time, from my personal experience in operations and now working with hundreds of restaurants, we've seen the same thing happen over and over again, where they go, this unit that does X volume, that has this menu and this wage in Edmonton, has the same square footage, seat count, similar revenue, same menu in Vancouver, they get the same labor cost target. Maybe it's 30%, maybe it's 12%, whatever if they're looking at it front of house, back of house total. But they just go similar volume, similar size, same concept, same menu, same target. And what we see happen quite often is that typically one of those two locations, or there might be more, becomes what they view as an underperforming business. And I've seen even to the point where it's like, well, it's time to make a management change because they're just not hitting their targets. And when we start to peel back the layers on that from compartmentalizing the data, looking at how productive the business is, what all those, factors around wage and customer spend and promotion and all those things are, quite often we find that the businesses that are underperforming are very often the most productive business because their whole team is just working so hard to try to achieve that target. And the other way, which actually is even scarier sometimes, is the locations that can be viewed as really high performing businesses because they have really low labor cost or they're hitting that industry standard target. Quite often, it's because they have really high average customer spend. Maybe the room is a little bit more simple to work, and they're quite often leaving money on the table because they're not overly productive. It's just kind of happens by accident. So we looked at two businesses, and this is kind of what I'm describing. Two businesses, same menu, same wage structure, same pricing, same square footage, same annual revenue within $100,000. And these are big restaurants that we looked at. The management change conversation was happening. We've got an underperformer. Maybe it's time for them to go. They don't understand the financials, that type of thing. And when we started to go through all of these different steps and let's really figure out how productive these businesses are and what the opportunity might be. The only difference between those two businesses was that one of them the bar team had to walk down a flight of stairs to get to the cooler. And the other location, the cooler was directly behind the bar. So location one that had to go down the stairs needed a bar porter basically 7 days a week. Location number two didn't. They only needed them on Friday and Saturday nights. That single thing changed the overall level of productivity enough in the restaurant that the company was actually viewing the GM as not able to manage financials. So had we not looked at that, they would have continued to push on the one location, which we later found out had higher turnover levels and, you know, all these different things because they're pushing and grinding on the team to try to get that result to happen. And what we also found was that the other location that the bar cooler was right here was probably leaving money on the table. They had actual opportunity to run their labor costs even lower than they were. So it's really, you know, this is one of the biggest lessons that we sort of feel like over the years we've learned and try to make sure we speak about as often as possible is that this industry standard thing, especially as costs go up and business models continue to change and purchasing get, you know, all of these things are changing really, really rapidly. If we don't understand this piece, it's just a really big opportunity for the industry in general. Okay, a couple scenarios on why industry standard business model doesn't exist. Went through it a little bit, but I'll just talk to you about this quickly. So restaurant number one, and these are some of the data points we would look at from a front of house perspective, right? Average wage, average spend, sales per week, guest count, employee hours, labor cost target, or labor cost actual, sorry, and what their covers per labor hour is actual. Okay, so if I look at these two businesses, I see that they both have the same wage. I see they have $26 or $29 spend. One of them's doing $3,000 a week more than the other one. Okay, their guest count is relatively close per week, right? Their employee hours 219 and 271, and they've got a different level of customer per labor hour happening. But those are businesses that both they do very similar revenue annually, right? They have the exact same wage structure, but one of them is running labor costs, service labor costs, front of house at 3% lower than the other one. And that's strictly because they have a bit higher spend and they are a bit more productive, right? But they're two businesses that have very similar volume. So it's important to make sure we sort of look at all the pieces that go into that. This next one, this is where, you know, taking this a little bit further on two businesses that are almost identical from the surface. Same wage, same spend, same revenue, same guest count. They just have a different service model. So they have a 6% different, and I didn't make this up, this is real, 6% different labor cost percentage. On the same revenue, on the same customer count, right? This is an example of how the space is laid out. So if anybody's in the process of looking at opening new spaces, there's a really good opportunity to use this type of lens to look through to say, okay, what should the space be like? What should the profit model look like? What is the business model for this? Even if it's the same size, the same number of seats, the same expected revenue, it can happen in lots of different ways. Right? And we've got, because of the service model, the scenario on the left, restaurant number one, I mean, especially if we look at the other couple of locations that we just went through, it's incredibly unproductive compared to the others. That doesn't mean necessarily good or bad at this point. Versus we had one in the last screen that was in the sixes, right? So this is about how service model impacts labor cost rather than just thinking about it from a revenue perspective. Okay, so the last slide I have here is just to talk a little bit about how to reward people. And this is where we talk a little bit more about how this can become an investment rather than just thinking about it in terms of a cost on the P&L. How to reward people based on productivity versus profit. So Adam, if it's okay if I say this, him and I've had lots of conversation about this concept about reward the behavior or reward the result. And I think for most of our industry, there's a lot of profit share type scenario. We hit our sales and profit targets, you make a little bit more money, you know, that kind of thing. But we always recommend that at least there's some consideration around reward based on productivity and workload rather than just what the end result is. Because if we go back to one of those other screens and say, I'm going to reward this manager if they hit 8% labor cost, Well, each one of these represents a week. I mean, based on all the variables that are going on, it's really hard for that person to control whether they hit 8% labor cost or not. But if we looked at this and said, I'm going to reward this person based on them achieving 6.5 covers per labor hour, it's really clear to say they just missed the target. Right? If we think about that another way, if we know, let's say we flip this and say that 6.5 covers per labor hour is too high. We don't want that. 6.5 is over this threshold, this invisible line of crossing into unsustainable workload levels. If we say to them, you'll get your bonus if you keep it below 6.5 covers per labor hour because we don't want to burn out our team. They did a really good job. And there's a good chance that a correlation between workload and employee retention is a real thing. We know that people, the locations that we look at that have higher than average within their category or their group or their company, higher than average levels of workload have, like I said before, lower average spend or declining average spend and higher than average turnover, especially with the generation that we're working with now. I mean, we're talking about workload over a long period of time. I mean, you might just tell them that they have to work and they don't come in, but just kidding, sorry. True story. Yeah. So, and again, just I'll sort of highlight this again. Productivity and workload, those two words, we use them interchangeably. And part of the challenge and the mission and whatnot is to make sure that whatever business it is that we're looking at, we do a really good job of identifying where that threshold is, where we cross from productivity, which is good, to workload issues, which is bad, right? And that would be different for literally every single business that exists. The revenue goes up, they probably get better tips, they get better service, the reviews go up. Like there's so many connectable things for sure. And that's what I've got for you in terms of slides. Thanks.
Broader than that, when we're talking about workload effectively, do you have models around salary base with salary base? Because there's lots of questions with hybrid, remote, fitting your salary, hours in the office.
Yeah. So when you say hourly versus salary, do you mean hourly employees versus management? Yeah. We do. And the way it gets a little bit tricky if you say you're on salary and just go, which we probably have all either been personally guilty of or are with the business in this industry, right? It's about, get things done. But where we would start with that is we would say, okay, by design, how many hours a week are you expecting your management to work? And maybe it's 45, maybe it's 50, maybe whatever it might be. So we would then build a model and say, okay, based on if actually everyone on the team is working 50 hours a week like they're supposed to, then we know what the cover count is. We would just calculate a covers per labor hour amount based on that. So maybe there's 4 managers, they work 50 hours a week, it's 200 management hours, or maybe there's 1 or 2. So we would just connect that way rather than using all of the hourly employee hours. And then we would go through the same process. We would look at what's happening from are they working more than 50? So in some cases, we've seen companies that have started to ask their managers, let's get you to punch in and punch out rather than just show up and then leave when you think you're done. Some companies like that. Some don't want their management to know how many hours they're working. But, there are ways to do it. It's about getting a baseline and then trying to find ways to leverage and move it forward. But absolutely, we've done lots of that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think it would depend, again, not to answer in a vague way, but it would depend on what the metrics are. So it could be things like the management hours against the number of kegs processed in the warehouse. And you could look at it from a manufacturing and warehouse perspective. You could look at it in terms of management hours versus hours of operation. You could look at it. I mean, there's lots of different ratios to use. It really depends what it is that you're trying to accomplish, though. And the hybrid concept, because you mentioned that quickly, we've done some interesting work on that hybrid. There's a concept in the US called Bar Taco that they're a full service hospitality company, full service restaurant with no servers. So the second that you get to the point where you're viewed as good enough or whatever, promotable into the service team and not from support, they immediately put everybody on salary so they can pay them benefits and vacation time and all that kind of stuff. But so what they're looking at is it's strictly management when it comes to how productive the business is. And what they're trying to do is, find ways to improve, provide hybrid work opportunity. So they're actually breaking it, not to ramble, but they're actually breaking it down to things like, what type of responsibility do you have that you have to be in the business to do? And what do you have that you can do outside of the business? And then finding ways to provide flex time for people so they have the choice of whether they want to be in the building or not to get work done. Happy to chat more after if you'd like, for sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So Adam's smirking. We've talked about this. The first thing we would do is we would start to track how many hours is the manager involved in service. So maybe that's the high volume time where they've got some staff, but they're taking a section type of thing. So we would start to look at that and see what their impact is on productivity in the business. Does it go up when they work more, or does it stay the same when they say they're working more? That type of thing, start to identify what's actually happening. In the down season, when revenue or customer count might drop, that's where we would probably change the conversation more to, and because this is coming up in January, this might be something to think about too, is we would start to look at it and go, okay, we can't run with less employees. We don't want to add an hourly person. So when we compartmentalize what's going on, what's left in order to make us more profitable? We can't affect the wage because they're on salary. We can't affect the productivity unless we drive more customer count. So let's work on spend, right? And start to just really be able to look at the pieces of the puzzle that we can affect. Does that answer your question? If it's at a period of the year where there are other hourly employees working around them, yeah, we would say, okay, if you can figure out how many hours a week that manager is actually actively taking a section or serving customers, not overseeing the floor or whatever it might be, that's where we would start. Figure out what impact they have on the productivity of the team at that point. Because you might be able to say, they're working 60 hours a week, but they have to be on the floor for 40, right? And that might start to impact both their execution level, their burnout, all that kind of thing. And you might be able to, change that quite easily.
Yeah, so we have a restaurant in brewery here in Vancouver, a restaurant, and I used to be hired when things like somebody who's pointing at the top and say about the restaurant, and then figured out that we have to have a problem at the brewery with kind of tracking our stuff. We thought we made a lot of money at the brewery from our hospitality operations, because we're lucky to sell well here. But as things started getting tougher and changed, like we lost a lot of retail stuff. So then we had to figure out that was part of our profit driver. We don't really I never cared about that. Never at all. So initially hired him for hired him to work with us. We started focusing on the restaurant, and it showed us wow, I thought we had all this extra profit because of how cheap it is to make your extra food and sell it, but how wasteful it is. So in our restaurant, we have two managers who run the restaurant. They also work. one of the things we noticed is, and more coming to winter, we'll have a recovery system. So, if I was just talking to my restaurant, labor percentage, they'd be like, I gotta be on the floor, gotta be on the floor, to the roof. I literally do not give a shit about labor percentage. I just manage productivity, and I say, please spend $630 at $80 an hour. If someone else, so you can figure out how to make more money in December, which sucks. And so, like, that's just like a really clear way that I never would have thought about that like that. And so they're like, oh, you know, I don't need to do sport. Like, you need to be figuring out how to grow a recipe to get more gas. Does that make sense? And so, like, that's just a way that we could really shift our thinking. Like, if I was hammering them, which I kind of did before, I'd be like, there's a cost, there's a cost. Like, well, we can't cut anymore. Like, the chef's like, 70 hours a week is too much. I'm like, yeah, that's like, we don't think about it like that. But if, so it's really, really helped shift our thinking about, and, also elevate some of our people to, like, our GM should be growing, thinking about how they get more people in. But if they need to be on 4 or 35 hours a week, they won't have any time to do that. So it's really helpful. We've literally been through that. Because at both of our locations, we have salary staff who work on the floor, and we've done weekly methods where we've had to pay them out, and in terms of the body numbers, and we've really, really high. It's giving them a whole lot of insight to make better decisions. We've been trying to grow a brunch program in Victoria at a restaurant, which is hard. We almost canceled it. It kind of makes up now like 15% of our weekly sales, which is very valuable. But we almost dropped it, and it's kind of changing to look at the different ways. And now I've got my GM coming to me, and this is more deal for 6 months. My GM will come to me and be like, you know what happens if we actually staff more people at lunch and not just taking orders? You know what productivity will achieve if it's selling a lot? And that's how we got our guest check up to like 35 bucks a person. Whereas when Christina and me got 10 the last weekend, our productivity was low, get up to 26 bucks. I'm like, oh shit, whereas if I was like, labor's too high, like, and so it really was eye-opening. Like, you can't do this, but this is a spreadsheet that I have that is like, I've got 20 columns of stuff. It takes my team 15 minutes every Monday to fill it out, and it gives us a lot of information. Every week I know how we did versus last week and what we're doing. When someone comes and says, let's do this, and we'll look at it, it's kind of close stuff. And it really, really helps. I mean, it's been super eye-opening to me. One of the reasons why I insisted with him speaks here is, like, I know we're all looking for things to, like, minimum wage and like will go up again next year. I'm assuming none of us are super bullish that sales will just be magically increased. So how are we going to manage all of that? And I think really shifting our thinking in terms of how we are going to think through this. So if anybody ever wants to hit me up for any information, I'm happy to send you crazy. And I will do that. And I know that a lot of us is on the front of the house, but we've done huge benefits from I'm happy to just share with you exactly what I have.
Appreciate that.
But I also have more time.
Yeah. We're working on his too. Just to
We have 5 people on our production team, and if I was doing it again, because of what I know now, I would absolutely make all of them hourly, and they're all done. And that was a mistake I made because I didn't like the payroll. Now I'm like, you lazy son. So yeah, this is, you could easily apply this to like a revenue per equity metric, or depending on what it is, maybe you don't for all of this free draft. Like there's so many free capital money, so there's so many things to do for that that's really shifted my thinking and the metrics that we use to run. We're just still a relatively small, not ultra sophisticated business, but I mean, this is like spreadsheet stuff that I can give to somebody who, they can plug those numbers in and get a result and just manage for that. So
yeah,
it's been super, super high.
Your comment, and thank you for the kind words. Your comment, yeah. I'll buy you lunch. your comment about the kitchen. So one of the, I think, you know, to give your team some credit, not that we'll just go back and forth here and high five each other, but one of the things with the back of house team that I've really noticed in the organization, more so than the individual running the kitchen, is the chef in one of these restaurants was working 6, if not 7 days a week, trying to make sure that the place was profitable, right? Control product, go to the store when I need to, order when I can, cover off my team, send someone home early, especially in some of the different times of the year, right? Heading into the fall this year, there was multiple discussions about I'm working 6 days a week or even 7. And thinking about it from a workload perspective, one of the things that Adam did with his team was he literally said to the chef, if your level of productivity in the kitchen is above a certain number, that means you're working too much, and this is not good. We don't want to see that number. Right. So it's actually incentivized him to work less, be more strategic, think about how to run that business in a better way, that he's not burning himself out trying to just hit a target. So
Will not be disqualified from going
yeah. Yeah, he's pretty good. Tim?
On here. I've never actually hired him from his services. If you're not following this man on LinkedIn, then you're missing out. His content that he shares daily on LinkedIn is fantastic. The newsletter that he creates, he gives so much information out that is valuable to people in our industry. The podcast that he's a part of, I'm a Jim fan.
Thanks.
I highly recommend it. Yeah, 27,000 followers now.
Or something like that, yeah.
Followers on LinkedIn. This man has a gift, and he's gonna help everybody.
To go hide behind the TV. Anyways, any other? I thought you had a question. Anything else I can answer for the group? We can connect. I'll give you I have a QR code you can scan and we can get in touch. Thanks so much. You're welcome.
I think we've got about 10 minutes left in our in a coffee break, but
I think I went over a couple minutes. Sorry
yeah,
about
you
that.
did. No, it was all the compliments.
It was Adam.
It was all the compliments you were I'm supposed to give you this from BC Craft Brewers Guild.
Thank you so much.